Srila Prabhupada Lilamrta, Volume 3. Only He Could Lead Them. San Francisco/India, 1967. A biography of His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, founder Acharya of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, by Satsvarup Das Goswami. Chapter 1. Swami Invites the Hippies. January 16th, 1967. As the United Airlines jet descended on the San Francisco Bay Area, Srila Prabhupada turned to his disciple Rana Chora and said, "The buildings look like matchboxes. Just imagine how it looks from Krishna's viewpoint." Srila Prabhupada was 71 years old, and this had been his first air trip. Rana Chora, 19 and dressed in a suit and tie, was supposed to be Srila Prabhupada's secretary. He was a new disciple, but had raised some money and had asked to fly to San Francisco with Prabhupada. During the trip, Srila Prabhupada had spoken little. He had been chanting, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. His right hand in his cloth bead bag, he had been fingering one bead after another as he chanted silently to himself. When the plane had first risen over New York City, he had looked out the window at the buildings growing smaller and smaller. Then the plane had entered the clouds, which to Prabhupada had appeared like an ocean in the sky. He had been bothered by pressure blocking his ears and had mentioned it. Otherwise, he hadn't said much, but had only chanted Krishna's names over and over. Now, as the plane began its descent, he continued to chant, his voice slightly audible, Krishna, Krishna, Krishna. And he looked out the window at the vista of thousands of matchbox houses and streets, stretching in charted patterns in every direction. When the announcement for United Airlines Flight 21 from New York came over the public address system, the group of about 50 hippies gathered closer together in anticipation. For a moment, they appeared almost apprehensive, unsure of what to expect or what the Swami would like. Roger Siegel. We were quite an assorted lot, even for the San Francisco airport. Mukunda was wearing a Merlin the Magician robe with paisley squares all around. Sam was wearing a Moroccan sheep robe with a hood. He even smelled like a sheep. And I was wearing a sort of blue homemade Japanese samurai robe with small white dots. Long strings of beads were everywhere. Buckskins, boots, army fatigues, people wearing small round sunglasses, the whole phantasmagoria of San Francisco at its height. Only a few people in the crowd knew Swamiji, Mukunda and his wife Janaki, Ravindra Swarup, Rai Ram, all from New York, and Allen Ginsberg was there. A few days before, Allen had been one of the leaders of the Human Be-In in Golden Gate Park, where over 200,000 had come together, a gathering of the tribes for a joyful powwow and peace dance. Today, Allen was on hand to greet Swami Bhaktivedanta, whom he had met and chanted with several months before on New York's Lower East Side. Swamiji would be pleased, Mukunda reminded everyone, if they were all chanting Hare Krishna when he came through the gate. They were already familiar with the Hare Krishna mantra. They had heard about the Swamis chanting in the park in New York, or they had seen the article about Swamiji and the chanting in the local underground paper, The Oracle. Earlier today, they had gathered in Golden Gate Park, most of them responding to a flyer Mukunda had distributed, and had chanted there for more than an hour before coming to the airport in a caravan of cars. Now, many of them, also in response to Mukunda's flyer, stood with incense and flowers in their hands. As the disembarking passengers entered the terminal gate and walked up the ramp, they looked in amazement at the reception party of flower-bearing chanters. The chanters, however, gazed past these ordinary tired-looking travelers searching for that special person who was supposed to be on the plane. Suddenly strolling toward them was the Swami, golden-complexioned, dressed in bright saffron robes. Prabhupada had heard the chanting even before he had entered the terminal, and he had begun to smile. He was happy and surprised. Glancing over the faces, he recognized only a few. Yet here were 50 people receiving him and chanting Hare Krishna without his having said a word. Mukunda. We just had to look at Swamiji, and then we bowed down, myself, my wife, and the friends I had brought, Sam and Marjorie, and then all of the young men and women there followed suit and all bowed down to Swamiji, just feeling very confident that it was the right and proper thing to do. The crowd of hippies had formed a line on either side of a narrow passage through which Swamiji would walk. As he passed among his new admirers, dozens of hands stretched out to offer him flowers and incense. He smiled, collecting the offerings in his hands while Ranachora looked on. Allen Ginsberg stepped forward with a large bouquet of flowers, and Srila Prabhupada graciously accepted it. Then Prabhupada began offering the gifts back to all who reached out to receive them. He proceeded through the terminal, the crowd of young people walking beside him chanting. At the baggage claim, Srila Prabhupada waited for a moment, his eyes taking in everyone around him. Lifting his open palms, he beckoned everyone to chant louder, and the group burst into renewed chanting, with Prabhupada standing in their midst, softly clapping his hands and singing Hare Krishna. Gracefully, he then raised his arms above his head and began to dance, stepping and swaying from side to side. To the mixed chagrin, amusement, and irresistible joy of the airport workers and passengers, the reception party stayed with Prabhupada until he got his luggage. Then they escorted him outside into the sunlight and into a waiting car, a black 1949 Cadillac Fleetwood. Prabhupada got into the back seat with Mukunda and Allen Ginsberg. Until the moment the car pulled away from the curb, Srila Prabhupada, still smiling, continued handing flowers to all those who had come to welcome him as he brought Krishna consciousness west. The Cadillac belonged to Harvey Cohen, who, almost a year before, had allowed Prabhupada to stay in his Bowery loft. Harvey was driving, but because of his chauffeur's hat picked up at a Salvation Army store, and his black suit and his beard, Prabhupada didn't recognize him. "Where is Harvey?" Prabhupada asked. "He's driving," Mukunda said. "Oh, is that you? I didn't recognize you." Harvey smiled. "Welcome to San Francisco, Swamiji." Srila Prabhupada was happy to be in another big Western city on behalf of his spiritual master Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati and Lord Chaitanya. The further west one goes, Lord Chaitanya had said, the more materialistic the people. Yet Lord Chaitanya had also said that Krishna consciousness should be spread all over the world. Prabhupada's godbrothers had often wondered about Lord Chaitanya's statement that one day the name of Krishna would be sung in every town and village. Perhaps that verse should be taken symbolically, they said. Otherwise, what could it mean? Krishna in every town? But Srila Prabhupada had deep faith in that statement by Lord Chaitanya and in the instruction of his spiritual master. Here he was in the far western city of San Francisco, and already people were chanting. They had enthusiastically received him with flowers and kirtan, and all over the world there were other cities much like this one. The temple Mukunda and his friends had obtained was on Frederick Street in the Haight-Ashbury district. Like the temple at 26 2nd Avenue in New York, it was a small storefront with a display window facing the street. A sign over the window read, Sri Sri Radha Krishna Temple. Mukunda and his friends had also rented a 3-room apartment for Swamiji on the 3rd floor of the adjoining building. It was a small, bare, run-down apartment facing the street. Followed by several carloads of devotees and curious seekers, Srila Prabhupada arrived at 518 Frederick Street and entered the storefront, which was decorated only by a few madras cloths on the wall. Taking his seat on a cushion, he led a kirtan and then spoke, inviting everyone to take up Krishna consciousness. After his lecture, he left the storefront and walked next door and up the 2 flights of stairs to his apartment. As he entered his apartment, number 32, he was followed not only by his devotees and admirers, but also by reporters from San Francisco's main newspapers, the Chronicle and the Examiner. While some devotees cooked his lunch and Ranachora unpacked his suitcase, Swamiji talked with the reporters who sat on the floor taking notes on their pads. Reporter: Downstairs, you said you were inviting everyone to Krishna consciousness. Does that include the Haight-Ashbury bohemians and beatniks? Prabhupada: Yes, everyone, including you or anybody else. But he or she what is called an acid head or a hippie or something else. But once he is accepted for training, he becomes something else from what he had been before. Reporter: What does one have to do to become a member of your movement? Prabhupada: There are 4 prerequisites. I do not allow my students to keep girlfriends. I prohibit all kinds of intoxicants, including coffee, tea, and cigarettes. I prohibit meat eating, and I prohibit my students from taking part in gambling. Reporter: Do these shall not commandments extend to the use of LSD, marijuana, and other narcotics? Prabhupada: I consider LSD to be an intoxicant. I do not allow any one of my students to use that or any intoxicant. I train my students to rise early in the morning and take a bath early in the day, and to attend prayer meetings 3 times a day. Our sect is one of austerity. It is the science of God. Although Prabhupada had found that reporters generally did not report his philosophy, he took the opportunity to preach Krishna consciousness. Even if the reporters didn't want to delve into the philosophy, his followers did. The big mistake of modern civilization, Srila Prabhupada continued, is to encroach upon others' property as though it were one's own. This creates an unnatural disturbance. God is the ultimate proprietor of everything in the universe. When people know that God is the ultimate proprietor, the best friend of all living entities, and the object of all offerings and sacrifices, then there will be peace. The reporters asked him about his background, and he told briefly about his coming from India and beginning in New York. After the reporters left, Prabhupada continued speaking to the young people in his room. Mukunda, who had allowed his hair and beard to grow, but who wore around his neck the strand of large red beads Swamiji had given him at initiation, introduced some of his friends and explained that they were all living together and that they wanted to help Swamiji present Krishna consciousness to the young people of San Francisco. Mukunda's wife Janaki asked Swamiji about his plane ride. He said it had been pleasant, except for some pressure in his ears. The houses looked like matchboxes, he said, and with his thumb and forefinger he indicated the size of a matchbox. He leaned back against the wall and took off the garlands he had received that day, until only a beaded necklace, a common inexpensive item with a small bell on it, remained hanging around his neck. Prabhupada held it, inspected the workmanship, and toyed with it. This is special, he said, looking up, because it was made with devotion. He continued to pay attention to the necklace, as if receiving it had been one of the most important events of the day. When his lunch arrived, he distributed some to everyone, and then Ranachora efficiently, though tactlessly, asked everyone to leave and give the Swami a little time to eat and rest. Outside the apartment and in the storefront below, the talk was of Swamiji. No one had been disappointed. Everything Mukunda had been telling them about him was true. They particularly enjoyed how he had talked about seeing everything from Krishna's viewpoint. That night on television, Swamiji's arrival was covered on the 11 o'clock news, and the next day it appeared in the newspapers. The Examiner's story was on page 2. Swami invites the hippies, along with a photo of the temple filled with followers and some shots of Swamiji who looked very grave. Prabhupada had Mukunda read the article aloud. The lanky master of the faith, Mukunda read, attired in a flowing ankle-long robe and sitting cross-legged on a big mattress. Swamiji interrupted. What is this word, lanky? Mukunda explained that it meant tall and slender. I don't know why they said that, he added. Maybe it's because you sit so straight and tall, so they think that you are very tall. The article went on to describe many of the airport greeters as being of the long-haired, bearded, and sandaled set. San Francisco's largest paper, the Chronicle, also ran an article, "Swami in Hippie Land. Holy Man opens SF Temple." The article began, "A holy man from India, described by his friend and beat poet Allen Ginsberg as one of the more conservative leaders of his faith, launched a kind of evangelistic effort yesterday in the heart of San Francisco's hippie haven." Srila Prabhupada objected to being called conservative. He was indignant. "Conservative? How is that?" "In respect to sex and drugs," Mukunda suggested. "Of course we are conservative in that sense," Prabhupada said. "That simply means we are following Shastra. We cannot depart from Bhagavad Gita, but conservative we are not." Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was so strict that he would not even look on a woman, but we are accepting everyone into this movement, regardless of sex, caste, position, or whatever. Everyone is invited to come chant Hare Krishna. This is Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's munificence, his liberality. No, we are not conservative. Srila Prabhupada rose from bed and turned on the light. It was 1 a.m. Although the alarm had not sounded and no one had come to wake him, he had risen on his own. The apartment was cold and quiet, wrapping his chadar around his shoulders. He sat quietly at his makeshift desk, a trunk filled with manuscripts, and in deep concentration chanted the Hare Krishna mantra on his beads. After an hour of chanting, Srila Prabhupada turned to his writing. Although 2 years had passed since he had published a book, the third and final volume of the first canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, he had daily been working, sometimes on his translation and commentary of the second canto, but mostly on Bhagavad Gita. In the 1940s in India, he had written an entire Bhagavad Gita translation and commentary, but his only copy had mysteriously disappeared. Then, in 1965, after a few months in America, he had begun again, starting with the introduction, which he had composed in his room on 72nd Street in New York. Now, thousands of manuscript pages filled his trunk, completing his Bhagavad Gita. If his New York disciple, Hayagriva, formerly an English professor, could edit it, and if some of the other disciples could get it published, that would be an important achievement. But publishing books in America seemed difficult, more difficult than in India. Even though in India he had been alone, he had managed to publish 3 volumes in 3 years. Here in America he had many followers, but many followers meant increased responsibilities, and none of his followers, as yet, seemed seriously inclined to take up typing, editing, and dealing with American businessmen. Yet, despite the dim prospects for publishing his Bhagavad Gita, Srila Prabhupada had begun translating another book, Chaitanya Charitamrita, the principal Vaishnava scripture on the life and teachings of Lord Chaitanya. Putting on his reading glasses, Prabhupada opened his books and turned on the dictating machine. He studied the Bengali and Sanskrit texts, then picked up the microphone, flicked the switch to record, flashing on a small red light, and began speaking. While the Lord was going, chanting and dancing, he spoke no more than a phrase at a time, flicking the switch, pausing, and then dictating again. Thousands of people were following him, and some of them were laughing, some were dancing, and some singing. Some of them were falling on the ground, offering obeisances to the Lord. Speaking and pausing, clicking the switch on and off, he would sit straight, sometimes gently rocking and nodding his head as he urged forward his words. Or he would bend low over his books, carefully studying them through his reading glasses. An hour passed and Prabhupada worked on. The building was dark except for Prabhupada's lamp and quiet except for the sound of his voice and the click and hum of the dictating machine. He wore a faded peach turtleneck jersey beneath his gray wool chadar, and since he had just risen from bed, his saffron dhoti was wrinkled. Without having washed his face or gone to the bathroom, he sat, absorbed in his work. At least for these few rare hours, the street and the Radha Krishna temple were quiet. This situation, with the dark night, the surroundings quiet, and him at his transcendental literary work, was not much different from his early morning hours in his room at the Radha Damodar temple in Vrindavan, India. There, of course, he had had no dictating machine, but he had worked during the same hours and from the same text, Chaitanya Charitamrita. Once he had begun a verse-by-verse translation with commentary, and another time he had written essays on the text. Now, having just arrived in this corner of the world, so remote from the scenes of Lord Chaitanya's pastimes, he was beginning the first chapter of a new English version of Chaitanya Charitamrita. He called it Teachings of Lord Chaitanya. He was following what had become a vital routine in his life, rising early and writing the parampara message of Krishna consciousness. Putting aside all other considerations, disregarding present circumstances, he would merge into the timeless message of transcendental knowledge. This was his most important service to Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. The thought of producing more books and distributing them widely inspired him to rise every night and translate. Prabhupada worked until dawn. Then he stopped and prepared himself to go down to the temple for the morning meeting. Though some of the New York disciples had objected, Srila Prabhupada was still scheduled for the Mantra Rock dance at the Avalon Ballroom. It wasn't proper, they had said, for the devotees out in San Francisco to ask their spiritual master to go to such a place. It would mean amplified guitars, pounding drums, wild light shows, and hundreds of drugged hippies. How could his pure message be heard in such a place? But in San Francisco, Mukunda and others had been working on the Mantra Rock dance for months. It would draw thousands of young people, and the San Francisco Radha Krishna temple stood to make thousands of dollars. So although among his New York disciples, Srila Prabhupada had expressed uncertainty, he now said nothing to deter the enthusiasm of his San Francisco followers. Sam Spearstra, Mukunda's friend and one of the Mantra Rock organizers, explained the idea to Hayagriva, who had just arrived from New York. There's a whole new school of San Francisco music opening up. The Grateful Dead have already cut their first record. Their offer to do this dance is a great publicity boost, just when we need it. But Swamiji says that even Ravi Shankar is Maya, Hayagriva said. Oh, it's all been arranged, Sam assured him. All the bands will be on stage and Allen Ginsberg will introduce Swamiji to San Francisco. Swamiji will walk and then chant Hare Krishna, Swamiji will talk and then chant Hare Krishna with the bands joining in. Then he leaves. There should be around 4,000 people there. Srila Prabhupada knew he would not compromise himself. He would go, chant, and then leave. The important thing was to spread the chanting of Hare Krishna. If thousands of young people gathering to hear rock music could be engaged in hearing him and chanting the names of God, then what was the harm? As a preacher, Prabhupada was prepared to go anywhere to spread Krishna consciousness. Since chanting Hare Krishna was absolute, one who heard or chanted the names of Krishna, anyone, anywhere, in any condition, could be saved from falling to the lower species in the next life. These young hippies wanted something spiritual, but they had no direction. They were confused, accepting hallucinations as spiritual visions. But they were seeking genuine spiritual life, just like many of the young people on the Lower East Side. Prabhupada decided he would go. His disciples wanted him to, and he was their servant and the servant of Lord Chaitanya. Mukunda, Sam, and Harvey Cohen had already met with rock entrepreneur Chet Helms, who had agreed that they could use his Avalon Ballroom, and that, if they could get the bands to come, everything above the cost for the groups, the security, and a few other basics would go as profit for the San Francisco Radha Krishna Temple. Mukunda and Sam had then gone calling on music groups, most of whom lived in the Bay Area, and one after another, the exciting new San Francisco rock bands, the Grateful Dead, Moby Grape, Big Brother and the Holding Company, Jefferson Airplane, Quicksilver Messenger Service, had agreed to appear with Swami Bhaktivedanta for the minimum wage of $250 per group. And Allen Ginsberg had agreed. The lineup was complete. In San Francisco, every rock concert had an art poster, many of them designed by the psychedelic artist called Mouse. One thing about Mouse's posters was that it was difficult to tell where the letters left off and the background began. He used dissonant colors that made his posters seem to flash on and off. Borrowing from this tradition, Harvey Cohen had created a unique poster, Krishna Consciousness Comes West. Using red and blue concentric circles and a candid photo of Swamiji smiling in Tompkins Square Park. The devotees put the posters up all over town. Hayagriva and Mukunda went to discuss the program for the Mantra Rock Dance with Allen Ginsberg. Allen was already well known as an advocate of the Hare Krishna mantra. In fact, acquaintances would often greet him with Hare Krishna when he walked on Haight Street, and he was known to visit and recommend that others visit the Radha Krishna temple. Hayagriva, whose full beard and long hair rivaled Allen's, was concerned about the melody Allen would use when he chanted with Swamiji. "I think the melody you use," Hayagriva said, "is too difficult for good chanting." "Maybe," Allen admitted, "but that's the melody I first heard in India. A wonderful lady saint was chanting it. I'm quite accustomed to it, and it's the only one I can sing convincingly." With only a few days remaining before the Mantra Rock Dance, Allen came to an early morning kirtan at the temple and later joined Srila Prabhupada upstairs in his room. A few devotees were sitting with Prabhupada eating Indian sweets when Allen came to the door. He and Prabhupada smiled and exchanged greetings, and Prabhupada offered him a sweet, remarking that Mr. Ginsberg was up very early. "Yes," Allen replied. "The phone hasn't stopped ringing since I arrived in San Francisco." "That is what happens when one becomes famous," said Prabhupada. "That was the tragedy of Mahatma Gandhi also. Wherever he went, thousands of people would crowd about him chanting, 'Mahatma Gandhi ki jai, Mahatma Gandhi ki jai.' The gentleman could not sleep." "Well, at least it got me up for kirtan this morning," said Allen. "Yes, that is good." The conversation turned to the upcoming program at the Avalon Ballroom. "Don't you think there's a possibility of chanting a tune that would be more appealing to Western ears?" Allen asked. "Any tune will do," said Prabhupada. "Melody is not important. What is important is that you will chant Hare Krishna. It can be in the tune of your own country, that doesn't matter." Prabhupada and Allen also talked about the meaning of the word hippie, and Allen mentioned something about taking LSD. Prabhupada replied that LSD created dependence and was not necessary for a person in Krishna consciousness. "Krishna consciousness resolves everything," Prabhupada said. "Nothing else is needed." At the Mantra Rock Dance, there would be a multimedia light show by the biggest names in the art, Ben Van Meter and Roger Hilliard. Ben and Roger were expert at using simultaneous strobe lights, films, and slideshows to fill an auditorium with optical effects reminiscent of LSD visions. Mukunda had given them many slides of Krishna to use during the kirtan. One evening, Ben and Roger came to see Swamiji in his apartment. Roger Hilliard: "He was great. I was really impressed. It wasn't the way he looked, the way he acted, or the way he dressed, but it was his total being. Swamiji was very serene and very humorous, and at the same time obviously very wise and in tune, enlightened. He had the ability to relate to a lot of different kinds of people. I was thinking, some of this must be really strange for this person, to come to the United States and end up in the middle of Haight-Ashbury with a storefront for an ashram and a lot of very strange people around. And yet he was totally right there with everybody." On the night of the Mantra Rock Dance, while the stage crew set up equipment and tested the sound system, and Ben and Roger organized their light show upstairs. Mukunda and others collected tickets at the door. People lined up all the way down the street and around the block waiting for tickets at $2.50 apiece. Attendance would be good, a capacity crowd, and most of the local luminaries were coming. LSD pioneer Timothy Leary arrived and was given a special seat on stage. Swami Kriyananda came, carrying a tambura. A man wearing a top hat and a suit with a silk sash that said San Francisco arrived, claiming to be the mayor. At the door, Mukunda stopped a respectably dressed young man who didn't have a ticket. But then someone tapped Mukunda on the shoulder. "Let him in, it's all right. He's Owsley." Mukunda apologized and submitted, allowing Augustus Owsley Stanley II, folk hero and famous synthesizer of LSD, to enter without a ticket. Almost everyone who came wore bright or unusual costumes: tribal robes, Mexican ponchos, Indian kurtas, God's eyes, feathers, and beads. Some hippies brought their own flutes, lutes, gourds, drums, rattles, horns, and guitars. The Hells Angels, dirty-haired, wearing jeans, boots, and denim jackets, and accompanied by their women, made their entrance, carrying chains, smoking cigarettes, and displaying their regalia of German helmets, emblazoned emblems, and so on. Everything but their motorcycles, which they had parked outside. The devotees began a warm-up kirtan on stage, dancing the way Swamiji had shown them. Incense poured from the stage and from the corners of the large ballroom. And although most in the audience were high on drugs, the atmosphere was calm. They had come seeking a spiritual experience. As the chanting began very melodiously, some of the musicians took part by playing their instruments. The light show began. Strobe lights flashed. Colored balls bounced back and forth to the beat of the music. Large blobs of pulsing color splurted across the floor, walls, and ceiling. A little after 8 o'clock, Moby Grape took the stage. With heavy electric guitars, electric bass, and 2 drummers, they launched into their first number. The large speakers shook the ballroom with their vibrations, and a roar of approval rose from the audience. Around 9:30, Prabhupada left his Frederick Street apartment and got into the back seat of Harvey's Cadillac. He was dressed in his usual saffron robes, and around his neck he wore a garland of gardenias, whose sweet aroma filled the car. On the way to the Avalon, he talked about the need to open more centers. At 10 o'clock, Prabhupada walked up the stairs of the Avalon, followed by Kirtanananda and Ranachora. As he entered the ballroom, devotees blew conch shells. Someone began a drum roll, and the crowd parted down the center, all the way from the entrance to the stage, opening a path for him to walk. With his head held high, Prabhupada seemed to float by as he walked through the strange milieu, making his way across the ballroom floor to the stage. Suddenly, the light show changed. Pictures of Krishna and his pastimes flashed onto the wall. Krishna and Arjuna riding together on Arjuna's chariot. Krishna eating butter. Krishna subduing the whirlwind demon. Krishna playing the flute. As Prabhupada walked through the crowd, everyone stood applauding and cheering. He climbed the stairs and seated himself softly on a waiting cushion. The crowd quieted. Looking over at Allen Ginsberg, Prabhupada said, "You can speak something about the mantra." Allen began to tell of his understanding and experience with the Hare Krishna mantra. He told how Swamiji had opened a storefront on 2nd Avenue and had chanted Hare Krishna in Tompkins Square Park. And he invited everyone to the Frederick Street Temple. "I especially recommend the early morning kirtans," he said, "for those who, coming down from LSD, want to stabilize their consciousness on re-entry." Prabhupada spoke, giving a brief history of the mantra. Then he looked over at Allen again. "You may chant." Allen began playing his harmonium and chanting into the microphone, singing the tune he had brought from India. Gradually, more and more people in the audience caught on and began chanting. As the kirtan continued and the audience got increasingly enthusiastic, musicians from the various bands came on stage to join in. Rana Chora, a fair drummer, began playing Moby Grape's drums. Some of the bass and other guitar players joined in as the devotees and a large group of hippies mounted the stage. The multicolored oil slicks pulsed, and the balls bounced back and forth to the beat of the mantra, now projected onto the wall. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. As the chanting spread throughout the hall, some of the hippies got to their feet, held hands, and danced. Allen Ginsberg. We sang Hare Krishna all evening. It was absolutely great, an open thing. It was the height of the Haight-Ashbury spiritual enthusiasm. It was the first time that there had been a music scene in San Francisco where everybody could be part of it and participate. Everybody could sing and dance rather than listen to other people sing and dance. Janaki. People didn't know what they were chanting for, but to see that many people chanting, even though most of them were intoxicated, made Swamiji very happy. He loved to see the people chanting. Hayagriva. Standing in front of the bands, I could hardly hear, but above all, I could make out the chanting of Hare Krishna building steadily. On the wall behind, a slide projected a huge picture of Krishna in a golden helmet with a peacock feather, a flute in his hand. Then Srila Prabhupada stood up, lifted his arms, and began to dance. He gestured for everyone to join him, and those who were still seated stood up and began dancing and chanting and swaying back and forth, following Prabhupada's gentle dance. Roger Siegel. The ballroom appeared as if it was a human field of wheat blowing in the wind. It produced a calm feeling in contrast to the Avalon ballroom atmosphere of gyrating energies. The chanting of Hare Krishna continued for over an hour, and finally everyone was jumping and yelling, even crying and shouting. Someone placed a microphone before Srila Prabhupada, and his voice resounded strongly over the powerful sound system. The tempo quickened. Srila Prabhupada was perspiring profusely. Kirtanananda insisted that the kirtan stop. Swamiji was too old for this, he said. It might be harmful. But the chanting continued faster and faster until the words of the mantra finally became indistinguishable amidst the amplified music and the chorus of thousands of voices. Then, suddenly, it ended, and all that could be heard was the loud hum of the amplifiers and Srila Prabhupada's voice ringing out, offering obeisances to his spiritual master. Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivrajak Acharya Ashto Darashata Sri Srimad Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Goswami Maharaj Ki Jai. All glories to the assembled devotees. Srila Prabhupada made his way off stage, through the heavy smoke and crowds, and down the front stairs, with Kirtanananda and Rana Chora close behind him. Allen announced the next rock group. As Swamiji left the ballroom and the appreciative crowd behind, he commented, "This is no place for a brahmachari." The next morning, the temple was crowded with young people who had seen Swamiji at the Avalon. Most of them had stayed up all night. Srila Prabhupada, having followed his usual morning schedule, came down at 7, held kirtan, and delivered the morning lecture. Later that morning, while riding to the beach with Kirtanananda and Hayagriva, Swamiji asked how many people had attended last night's kirtan. When they told him, he asked how much money they had made, and they said they weren't sure, but it was approximately $1,500. Half-audibly, he chanted in the back seat of the car, looking out the window as quiet and unassuming as a child, with no indication that the night before he had been cheered and applauded by thousands of hippies who had stood back and made a grand aisle for him to walk in triumph across the strobe-lit floor amid the thunder of the electric basses and pounding drums of the Avalon ballroom. For all the fanfare of the night before, he remained untouched, the same as ever in personal demeanor. He was aloof, innocent, and humble, while at the same time appearing very grave and ancient. As Kirtanananda and Hayagriva were aware, Swamiji was not of this world. They knew that he, unlike them, was always thinking of Krishna. They walked with him along the boardwalk near the ocean, with its cool breezes and cresting waves. Kirtanananda spread the chadar over Prabhupada's shoulders. In Bengali, there is one nice verse, Prabhupada remarked, breaking the silence. I remember. Oh, what is that voice across the sea calling, calling, come here, come here. Speaking little, he walked the boardwalk with his two friends, frequently looking out at the sea and sky. As he walked, he softly sang a mantra that Kirtanananda and Hayagriva had never heard before. Govinda Jai Jai, Gopala Jai Jai, Radha Ramana Hari Govinda Jai Jai. He sang slowly in a deep voice as they walked along the boardwalk. He looked out at the Pacific Ocean. Because it is great, it is tranquil. The ocean seems to be eternal, Hayagriva ventured. No, Prabhupada replied, nothing in the material world is eternal. In New York, since there were so few women present at the temple, people had inquired whether it were possible for a woman to join the Krishna consciousness movement. But in San Francisco, that question never arose. Most of the men who came to learn from Swamiji came with their girlfriends. To Prabhupada, these boys and girls, eager for chanting and hearing about Krishna, were life sparks of faith to be fanned into steady blazing fires of devotional life. There was no question of his asking the newcomers to give up their girlfriends or boyfriends, and yet he uncompromisingly preached no illicit sex. The dilemma, however, seemed to have an obvious solution: marry the couples in Krishna consciousness. Because traditionally a sannyasi would never arrange or perform marriages by Indian standards, someone might criticize Prabhupada for allowing any mingling of the sexes. But Prabhupada gave priority to spreading Krishna consciousness. What Indian, however critical, had ever tried to transplant the essence of India's spiritual culture into the Western culture? Prabhupada saw that to change the American social system and completely separate the men from the women would not be possible. But to compromise his standard of no illicit sex was also not possible. Therefore, Krishna-conscious married life, the Grihastha ashram, would be the best arrangement for many of his new aspiring disciples. In Krishna consciousness, husband and wife could live together and help one another in spiritual progress. It was an authorized arrangement for allowing a man and woman to associate. If, as spiritual master, he found it necessary to perform marriages himself, he would do it. But first, these young couples would have to become attracted to Krishna consciousness. Joan Campanella had grown up in a wealthy suburb of Portland, Oregon, where her father was a corporate tax attorney. She and her sister had had their own sports cars and their own boats for sailing on Lake Oswego. Disgusted by the sorority life at the University of Oregon, Joan had dropped out during her first term and enrolled at Reed College, where she had studied ceramics, weaving, and calligraphy. In 1963, she had moved to San Francisco and become the co-owner of a ceramics shop. Although she had then had many friends, among fashionable shopkeepers, folk singers, and dancers, she had remained aloof and introspective. It was through her sister Jan that Joan had first met Srila Prabhupada. Jan had gone with her boyfriend, Michael Grant, to live in New York City, where Michael had worked as a music arranger. In 1965, they had met Swamiji while he was living alone on the Bowery, and they had become his initiated disciples, Mukunda and Janaki. Swamiji had asked them to get married, and they had invited Joan to the wedding. As a wedding guest for one day, Joan had then briefly entered Swamiji's transcendental world at 26 Second Avenue, and he had kept her busy all day making dough and filling kachori pastries for the wedding feast. Joan had worked in one room and Swamiji had worked in the kitchen, although he had repeatedly come in and guided her in making the kachoris properly, telling her not to touch her clothes or body while cooking, and instructing her not to smoke cigarettes, because the food was to be offered to Lord Krishna, and therefore had to be prepared purely. Joan had been convinced by this brief association that Swamiji was a great spiritual teacher, but she had returned to San Francisco without pursuing Krishna consciousness further. A few months later, Mukunda and Janaki had driven to the West Coast with plans of going soon to India, but had changed their plans when Mukunda had received a letter from Swamiji asking him to try to start a Krishna-conscious temple in California. Mukunda had talked about Swamiji to Joan and other friends, and he had found that a lot of young people were interested. Joan had then accompanied Mukunda, Janaki, and a boy named Roger Siegel to the mountains in Oregon, where they had visited their mutual friends Sam and Marjorie, who had been living in a forest lookout tower. Mukunda had explained what he had known of Krishna consciousness, and the six of them had begun chanting Hare Krishna together. They had been especially interested in Swamiji's teachings about elevating consciousness without drugs. Mukunda had talked excitedly about Swamiji's having asked him to start a temple in California, and soon he and his wife Janaki Sam and his girlfriend Marjorie, and Roger and Joan, now intimate friends, had moved to an apartment in San Francisco to find a storefront and set the stage for Swamiji. After Swamiji's arrival, Joan had begun attending the temple kirtans. She felt drawn to Swamiji and the chanting, and she especially liked the informal visiting hours. Swamiji would sit in his rocking chair with his hand in his bead bag chanting the holy names, and Joan would sit fascinated watching his fingers moving within the bag. One day, during Swamiji's visiting hours, while Swamiji was sitting in his rocking chair and Joan and others were sitting at his feet, Janaki's cat crept in through the hallway door and began slowly coming down the hallway. The cat came closer and closer and slowly meandered right in front of Swamiji's feet. It sat down looking up intently at Swamiji and began to meow. None of the devotees knew what to expect. Swamiji began gently stroking the back of the cat with his foot, saying, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. Are you feeding him prasadam milk? Joan: I was touched by Swamiji's activities and his kindness, even to cats, and I longed for more association with him. Joan came to understand that serving Swamiji was a serious matter, but she didn't want to jump into initiation until she was 100% sure about it. Sometimes she would cry in ecstasy, and sometimes she would fall asleep during Swamiji's lecture. So she remained hesitant and skeptical, wondering, how can I actually apply Swamiji's teachings to my life? One evening, Swamiji asked her, when are you going to be initiated? Joan said that she didn't know, but that she relished reading his books and chanting Hare Krishna. She said that because she was attracted to the mountains and to elevated spiritual consciousness, she wanted to travel to Tibet. Swamiji, sitting in his rocking chair, looked down at Joan as she sat at his feet. She felt he was looking right through her. I can take you to a higher place than Tibet, he said. Just see. Joan suddenly felt that Swamiji knew everything about her, and she understood. Oh, I have to see through his eyes what Krishna consciousness is. He was promising that he would take her to some very elevated realm, but she would have to see it. It was then that Joan decided to become Swamiji's disciple. When she told her boyfriend Roger, he was astounded. He and Joan had been coming to the kirtans and lectures together, but he still had doubts. Maybe it would be good for him and Joan to get married, but not initiated. Joan, however, was more determined. She explained to Roger that Swamiji hadn't come just to perform marriages. You had to get initiated first. Roger Siegel had grown up in New York. He was following a Hatha Yoga guru, had experimented with psychedelic chemicals, and had traveled in the Deep South as a civil rights activist, taking part in freedom marches with the blacks. Large-bodied, sociable, and outgoing, he had lots of friends in San Francisco. At the airport, in a merry mood with the Haight-Ashbury crowd, he had seen Swamiji for the first time, and been especially struck by Swamiji's regal bearing and absence of self-consciousness. The concept of reincarnation had always intrigued him, but after attending some of Swamiji's lectures and hearing him explain transmigration of the soul, he felt he had found someone who definitely knew the answer to any question about life after death. One night, after attending the program at the temple, Roger returned to his apartment and sat down on the fire escape to meditate on what Swamiji had said. The world is false, he had said. But it feels real to me, Roger thought. If I pinch my arm, I feel pain. So how is that illusion? This fire escape is real, otherwise I would be falling in space. This space is real, isn't it? Roger decided he didn't understand what Swamiji meant by illusion. If I try to walk through the wall, he thought, would that be real or not? Maybe the wall's reality is just in my mind. To test the illusion, he went inside his apartment, concentrated his mind, and walked against the wall. Smack. He sat down again and thought, what does Swamiji mean when he says that the world is illusion? He decided he should ask at the next meeting. He did, and Srila Prabhupada told him that actually the world is real, because it was created by God, the Supreme Reality. But it is unreal in the sense that everything material is temporary. When a person takes the temporary world to be permanent, and all in all, he is in illusion. Only the spiritual world, Swamiji explained, is eternal and therefore real. Raj was satisfied by Swamiji's answer, but he had other difficulties. He thought Swamiji too conservative. When Swamiji said that people's dogs must be kept outside the temple, Roger didn't like it. Many visitors brought pet dogs with them to the temple, and now there was a hitching post in front of the building just to accommodate the pets on leashes. But Swamiji wouldn't allow any pets inside. This philosophy is for humans, he said. A cat or dog cannot understand it. Although, if he hears the chanting of Hare Krishna, he can receive a higher birth in the future. Roger also had other points of contention with what he considered Swamiji's conservative philosophy. Swamiji repeatedly spoke against uncontrolled habits like smoking, but Roger couldn't imagine giving up such things. And the instructions about restricting sex life especially bothered him. Yet, despite his not following very strictly, Roger felt himself developing a love for Swamiji and Krishna. He sensed that Swamiji had much to teach him, and that Swamiji was doing it in a certain way and a certain order. Roger knew that Swamiji saw him as a baby in spiritual life who had to be spoon-fed. He knew he had to become submissive and accept whatever Swamiji gave him. Sam Spearstra, tall and slender, with curly reddish gold hair, was athletic. He had trained as an Olympic skier, yet artistic. He was a writer and wood sculptor. He had graduated from Reed College in Oregon and gone on as a Fulbright scholar to a small college in Switzerland where he had obtained an M.A. in philosophy. He was popular, as Mukunda saw him, the epitome of the rugged individualist. When Mukunda had visited Sam at his mountain lookout tower and told him about Swamiji and Krishna consciousness, Sam had been intrigued by the new ideas. Sam's life had nearly reached a dead end, but he had seen hope in what Mukunda and Janaki had been saying about Swamiji. After spending only a few days with Mukunda, Sam had been eager to help him establish a temple of Krishna consciousness in San Francisco. Sam was the one who knew the local rock stars and had persuaded them to appear at the Avalon with Swami Bhaktivedanta, whom he had never met. Sam had seen Swamiji for the first time when Swamiji had arrived at the San Francisco airport, and Sam had later insisted that he had seen a flash of light come from Swamiji's body. At first, Sam had been afraid to say anything, nor had he known what to say. Prabhupada was completely new to him and seemed so elevated. But the day after the program at the Avalon, when Mukunda told Prabhupada that Sam had arranged the dance, Prabhupada sent for him to find out how much money they had made. Sitting across from Prabhupada, who sat behind his small desk, Sam informed him that they had made about $1,500 profit. Well then, Srila Prabhupada said, you will be the treasurer. Then Srila Prabhupada asked him, what is your idea of God? God is one, Sam replied. Prabhupada asked, what is the purpose of worshiping God? Sam replied, to become one with God. No, Prabhupada said, you cannot become one with God. God and you are always two different individuals. But you can become one in interest with him. And then he told Sam about Krishna. After they talked, Prabhupada said, you can come up every day and I will teach you how to do books. So Sam began meeting with Prabhupada for half an hour a day to learn bookkeeping. Sam, I had never been very good at keeping books, and I really didn't want to do it. But it was a good excuse to come and see Swamiji every day. He would chew me out when I would spend too much money or when I couldn't balance the books properly. I really loved the idea that he was so practical, that he knew bookkeeping. He became so much more of a friend from the beginning rather than some idealized person from another sphere of life. I took almost all my practical questions to him. I learned to answer things for myself based on the way Swamiji always answered day-to-day problems. And the first thing he made me do was to get married to my girlfriend. Mukunda and his wife Janaki, whose apartment was just down the hall from Srila Prabhupada's, were the only couple Srila Prabhupada had already initiated and married. Mukunda, who often wore his strand of large red japa beads in 2 loose loops around his neck, had grown long hair and a short, thick black beard since coming to San Francisco. He had entered the Summer of Love spirit of Haight-Ashbury and was acquainted with many of the popular figures. Although occasionally earning money as a musician, he spent most of his time promoting Prabhupada's mission, especially by meeting people to arrange gala programs like the one at the Avalon. He was a leader in bringing people to assist Prabhupada. Yet he had no permanent sense of commitment. He was helping because it was fun. Having little desire to be different from his many San Francisco friends, he did not strictly follow Prabhupada's principles for regulated spiritual life. In his exchanges with Srila Prabhupada, Mukunda liked to assume a posture of fraternal camaraderie rather than one of menial servitude, and Srila Prabhupada reciprocated. Sometimes, however, Prabhupada would assert himself as the teacher. Once, when Prabhupada walked into Mukunda's apartment, he noticed a poster on the wall showing a matador with a cape and sword going after a bull. "This is a horrible picture," Srila Prabhupada exclaimed, his face showing displeasure. Mukunda looked at the poster, realizing for the first time what it meant. "Yes, it is horrible," he said, and tore it off the wall. Srila Prabhupada was eager to have someone play the mridanga properly during the kirtans, and Mukunda, a musician, was a likely candidate. Mukunda. The day the drum came, I asked Swamiji if I could learn, and he said yes. I asked him when, and he said, "When do you want?" "Now?" I asked. He said, "Yes." I was a little surprised to get such a quick appointment. But I brought the drum to his room, and he began to show me the basic beat. First there was Gita-ta, 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 and then one slightly more complicated beat, Gita-ta, 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 Gita. As I began to play the beat, I kept speeding it up, and he kept telling me to slow down. He spent a lot of time just showing me how to strike the heads of the drum. Then I finally began to get it a little. But he had to keep admonishing me to slow down and pronounce the syllables as I hit the drum. Gita-ta. The syllables, he said, and the drum should sound the same. The syllables. The syllables, he said, and the drum should sound the same. I should make it sound like that and always pronounce them. I was determined and played very slowly for a long, long time. I was concentrating with great intensity. Then, suddenly I was aware of Swamiji standing motionless beside me. I didn't know how long he was going to stand there without saying anything, and I became a little uncomfortable. But I continued playing. When I got up the courage to look up and see his face, to my surprise he was moving his head back and forth in an affirming way, with his eyes closed. He seemed to be enjoying the lesson. This came as a complete surprise to me. Although I had taken music lessons before and had spent many years taking piano lessons, I can never remember an instance when the teacher seemed to actually enjoy me playing. I felt very wonderful to see that here was a teacher who was so perfect, who enjoyed what he was teaching so much. Not because it was his personal teaching or his personal method, but because he was witnessing Krishna's energy pass through him to a conditioned soul like myself. And he was getting great pleasure out of it. I had a deeper realization that Swamiji was a real teacher, although I had no idea what a spiritual master really was. To Mukunda's wife Janaki, Krishna consciousness meant dealing in a personal way with Swamiji. As long as he was around, she was all right. She enjoyed asking him questions, serving him, and learning from him how to cook. She didn't care much for studying the philosophy of Krishna consciousness, but she quickly developed an intense attraction for him. Janaki. There were a group of us sitting around in Swamiji's apartment, and I asked him if he had any children. He looked at me as if I had said something strange, and he said, "You are not my child?" I said, "Well, yes." And he said, "Are not all these my children?" And his answer was so quick that I never doubted that he seriously meant what he said. For several hours each morning, Prabhupada showed Janaki, Joan, and others how to cook. One day in the kitchen, he noticed a kind of berry he had never tasted, and he asked Janaki what they were. She told him strawberries. He immediately popped one into his mouth, saying, "That's very tasty." And he proceeded to eat another and another, exclaiming, "Very tasty." One time, Janaki was making whipped cream when Prabhupada came into the kitchen and asked, "What's that?" She replied, "It's whipped cream." "What is whipped cream?" he asked. "It's cream," she replied, "but when you beat it, it fluffs up into a more solid form." Although always adamant about kitchen rules, one of the most important being that no one could eat in the kitchen, Srila Prabhupada immediately dipped his finger into the whipped cream and tasted it. "This is yogurt," he said. In a light-hearted reprimanding way that was her pleasure, Janaki replied, "No, Swamiji, it's whipped cream." Srila Prabhupada corrected her, "No, it is yogurt." And again, he put his finger into it and tasting it, saying, "Oh, it tastes very nice." "Swamiji," Janaki accused him, "you're eating in the kitchen." Srila Prabhupada merely smiled and shook his head back and forth, saying, "That's all right." Janaki. One time I told him, "Swamiji, I had the most exciting dream. We were all on a planet of our very own. And everybody from Earth had come there. They had all become pure devotees, and they were all chanting. You were sitting on a very special chair high off the ground, and the whole earth was clapping and chanting Hare Krishna. Swamiji smiled and said, "Oh, that's such a lovely dream." I'm about halfway through this chapter, and it seems like a good place to stop. So I'm going to stop recording, and I'll record the second half of this chapter as a part 2. Haribol.